On a rain-soaked November evening in 1952, the Eleganté Hotel stood like a glittering fortress against the storm-darkened streets of Manhattan's Upper East Side. Neon light from the hotel's marquee cast crimson shadows across the wet pavement, where yellow taxicabs hissed through puddles and well-dressed patrons hurried beneath black umbrellas toward the warmth of marble lobbies and crystal chandeliers. Inside this temple of luxury, where senators rubbed shoulders with movie stars and oil barons courted politicians over aged whiskey, no one suspected that death had already claimed the penthouse floor. The elevator operator, a thin man named Edgar Fitzgerald, whose white gloves had polished brass buttons for 37 years, noticed the smell first. It drifted down from the 23rd floor like invisible fog, sweet and cloying, mixing with the scent of expensive perfume and cigarette smoke that usually filled the air. Edgar's weathered fingers trembled slightly as he guided the ornate elevator cage past floor after floor, the brass arrow marking their ascent with mechanical precision. Something was wrong. In all his years at the Eleganté, he had never encountered such an odor, something that made his stomach clench and his mind recoil from possibilities he didn't want to consider. Detective Lieutenant William Bill Crawford received the call at 11:47 p.m. just as he was settling into his favorite chair with a glass of bourbon and yesterday's newspaper. The voice on the other end belonged to Sergeant Murphy, whose Irish accent always grew thicker when he was nervous. "We've got a situation at the Eleganté Hotel, Bill. High-profile guest, room 38. You're gonna want to see this one yourself." Crawford's reflection stared back at him from the dark window of his apartment as he reached for his coat. A man of 42 with graying temples and eyes that had seen too much of humanity's darker nature. The war had left its mark on him, not in visible scars, but in the way he approached each case with the methodical precision of someone who understood that evil often wore the most beautiful masks. Tonight, he sensed, would test that understanding once again. The Eleganté Hotel's lobby pulsed with controlled chaos when Crawford arrived. Uniformed officers moved discreetly through clusters of wealthy guests, their voices hushed but urgent as they collected names and statements. The hotel's general manager, an impeccably dressed man named Charles Whitmore, paced near the reception desk like a caged animal, his usually perfect composure fractured by the crisis unfolding in his pristine establishment. "Detective Crawford," Whitmore's voice carried the strain of a man watching his reputation crumble in real time. "Thank God you're here. This is unprecedented. In 40 years of operation, the Eleganté has never..." "Save the history lesson," Crawford interrupted, his keen eyes already scanning the scene. "What do we know?" Officer Patricia Henley, one of the few female detectives in the department and Crawford's most trusted partner, emerged from the elevator with her notebook already filling with observations. Her auburn hair was pulled back severely, and her gray eyes missed nothing as she approached. "Victim is Vincent Ashworth, age 58, registered in room 38 since Monday. Hotel staff found him approximately 2 hours ago when he failed to respond to multiple phone calls about a dinner reservation." The name sent a ripple of recognition through Crawford's mind. Vincent Ashworth, millionaire defense contractor, rumored to have intimate connections with senators and military officials, a man whose business dealings existed in the gray areas between legitimate commerce and something far more sinister. If Ashworth was dead, the implications reached far beyond a simple homicide. The elevator ride to the 23rd floor felt interminable. Edgar Fitzgerald operated the controls with visible reluctance, his hands shaking as he guided them upward past floors filled with oblivious guests, enjoying their evening entertainment. The smell grew stronger with each passing floor, until even Crawford, who had investigated countless crime scenes, found himself breathing through his mouth. Room 338 existed in a different world from the glittering lobby below. Here, luxury had been transformed into something grotesque. Vincent Ashworth's body lay sprawled across an antique Persian rug, his expensive suit wrinkled and stained, his face frozen in an expression of surprise and terror, that suggested his final moments had been anything but peaceful. The room itself told a story of interrupted elegance. A half-finished brandy on the mahogany side table, classical music still playing softly from a radio in the corner, and French doors leading to a balcony that remained mysteriously ajar, despite the November rain. Dr. Margaret Reeves, the city's chief medical examiner, knelt beside the body with professional detachment. Her silver hair caught the lamplight as she examined Ashworth's neck with a magnifying glass. Her movements precise and methodical. "Preliminary examination suggests strangulation," she said without looking up. "But there are some unusual aspects. No defensive wounds, no signs of struggle. It's as if he simply allowed it to happen." Crawford circled the room like a predator, his trained eye cataloging every detail. The bed remained perfectly made, military corners sharp enough to cut. Ashworth's briefcase sat open on the writing desk, papers scattered as if someone had been searching for something specific. Most intriguingly, a second brandy glass sat on the coffee table, lipstick marks still visible on the rim, evidence of a visitor who had shared Ashworth's final evening. "Any witnesses?" Crawford asked, though he suspected the answer would complicate rather than clarify the situation. Hindley consulted her notes, her voice carefully neutral. Several guests reported hearing what sounded like an argument around 9:30 p.m. Voices, one male, one female, but nothing clearly audible through the walls. The guest in 3047 described it as passionate but not violent. Room service delivered dinner for two at 8:45 p.m. The waiter, a young man named Tommy Santos, said Ashworth was alone at that time but seemed to be expecting someone. The French doors called Crawford's attention like a siren song. He stepped onto the balcony, rain immediately soaking through his fedora as he examined the ornate railing. 23 floors below, Central Park stretched into darkness, its bare trees like skeletal fingers against the storm clouds. The balcony connected to a fire escape that wound down the building's exterior, a possible escape route that would allow someone to leave without using the elevator or main staircase. Back inside, Crawford's examination of Ashworth's personal effects revealed a man living on the edge of multiple worlds. His wallet contained not just the usual credit cards and cash, but also a membership card to an exclusive gentleman's club, business cards from arms dealers and government officials, and most intriguingly, a small photograph of a woman Crawford didn't recognize, beautiful dark-haired with eyes that seemed to hold secrets. "Look at this," Henley called from the writing desk. She held up a letter, partially hidden beneath other papers, written in elegant feminine handwriting. The visible portion read, "Vincent, darling, you know I can't keep playing these games forever. Some secrets are too dangerous to keep, and some people too powerful to cross. Tonight changes everything." The letter ended abruptly, as if torn away intentionally. Crawford felt the familiar tingle of a case that would consume his nights and haunt his dreams. Ashworth hadn't simply been murdered, he had been silenced. But by whom, and about what secrets that were worth killing for? Hotel Security Chief Robert Kane appeared in the doorway, a former police detective whose broad shoulders and suspicious eyes spoke of years spent dealing with the senior side of luxury hospitality. "Detective Crawford, we've got a problem. The elevator logs show someone accessed the 23rd floor at 9:45 p.m. using a master key. Problem is, only 4 people have master keys, and all 4 have alibis." Crawford felt the pieces of a complex puzzle beginning to take shape, each one more troubling than the last. An inside job, but with alibis that couldn't be broken. A passionate argument that ended in methodical murder, a victim whose business dealings touched the highest levels of government and the darkest corners of international commerce. And somewhere in the city, a woman with dark hair and dangerous secrets, who had shared Vincent Ashworth's final evening and possibly orchestrated his final breath. The storm outside intensified, rain lashing against the windows as if nature itself recoiled from the events in room 300. Crawford studied the crime scene one more time, his detective's instincts screaming that they were missing something crucial, some detail that would crack the case wide open. The lipstick on the brandy glass, the torn letter, the impossible master key access. Each clue led deeper into a labyrinth of wealth, power, and deadly secrets. As the medical examiner's team prepared to remove Ashworth's body, Crawford noticed something that made his blood run cold. Partially hidden beneath the antique rug, just visible in the lamplight, was a small golden pin, an eagle clutching arrows in its talons, the kind worn by high-ranking military officers and government officials. But this wasn't just any pin. Crawford recognized the specific design from his own military service, classified intelligence division, the kind of assignment that didn't officially exist and left no paper trail. He palmed the pin without alerting the others, his mind racing through implications that stretched far beyond a simple murder in a luxury hotel. Vincent Ashworth hadn't just been a defense contractor. He had been connected to the shadow world of government intelligence, where fortunes were made and lost on state secrets, and where people disappeared for knowing too much. Standing in room 380, surrounded by the detritus of a life cut short, Crawford realized he wasn't just investigating a murder. He was stepping into a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of American power, where the stakes were measured not in dollars but in national security, and where the wrong move could cost not just his career, but his life. The Eleganté Hotel had kept many secrets over the years, but none as dangerous as the one now spreading like poison through its elegant corridors. As Crawford prepared to leave the crime scene, he couldn't shake the feeling that Vincent Ashworth's death was just the beginning, the first domino in a chain reaction that would expose secrets powerful people had killed to protect. In the distance, through the rain-soaked windows, the lights of Manhattan glittered like scattered diamonds, beautiful and cold. Somewhere in that vast urban landscape, a killer walked free, carrying secrets worth dying for, and the confidence that came from knowing they had committed the perfect crime. But Detective Bill Crawford had spent his career proving that no crime was perfect, no secret was safe forever, and no killer was beyond the reach of justice. As he stepped into the elevator with Edgar Fitzgerald's nervous hands operating the controls, Crawford knew that the real investigation was just beginning, and that before it was over, the elegant facade of the Eleganté Hotel would crumble to reveal the corruption festering beneath. The golden pin felt heavy in his pocket, a tangible reminder that some murders were about more than passion or money. They were about power, about national secrets, and about the deadly price of knowing too much in a world where information was the most valuable and dangerous currency of all. The morning after Vincent Ashworth's murder dawned gray and unforgiving over Manhattan, the kind of November day that made even the most optimistic souls question the possibility of spring's return. Detective Bill Crawford sat in his office at police headquarters, the intelligence pin spread before him on his desk like an accusation made manifest. Coffee had long grown cold in his cup as he stared at the small golden eagle, its talons clutching arrows that seemed to pierce through the fabric of what he thought he understood about law and order in America. The pin bore no serial numbers, no identifying marks that would appear in any official records. Crawford knew this because he had spent 3 hours on the phone with contacts from his military days, men whose voices carried the weight of classified operations and unspoken loyalties. The silence that greeted his inquiries told him more than any official denial ever could. Vincent Ashworth had been connected to operations that existed in the shadow space between legal and necessary, where patriotism and profit blurred into something altogether more sinister. Patricia Henley entered his office carrying a manila folder thick with preliminary reports, her usually impeccable appearance showing signs of a sleepless night. Dark circles beneath her gray eyes spoke of hours spent combing through Ashworth's background, following paper trails that led through a maze of shell companies, government contracts, and international business dealings that defied easy explanation. "The rabbit hole goes deeper than we thought," she said, settling into the chair across from Crawford's desk. Ashworth wasn't just a defense contractor. He was a broker, the kind of man who connected people who should never meet, who facilitated transactions that officially never happened. Arms deals, intelligence contracts, technology transfers. His legitimate business was just the tip of an iceberg that could sink careers and topple administration. Crawford studied the documents Henley spread across his desk. Bank records showed payments from sources that read like a who's who of international intrigue. Swiss accounts, Panamanian shell companies, Vatican banking institution. Ashworth had been moving money for people whose very existence was classified, whose operations required the kind of absolute secrecy that made murder seem like a reasonable business expense. "What about the woman?" Crawford asked, his fingers unconsciously touching the photograph they had found in Ashworth's wallet. The beautiful brunette with knowing eyes stared back at him from the black and white image, her smile containing secrets that had potentially cost Ashworth his life. Henley's expression darkened. "That's where things get interesting. I showed the photograph to the hotel staff. 3 people identified her immediately. Sophia Castellano, age 34, Italian-American, allegedly a high-end art dealer who specializes in private acquisitions for wealthy collectors. She's been a regular guest at the Eleganté for the past 6 months. Always paying cash, always alone until she started meeting with Ashworth." The name triggered recognition in Crawford's memory. Sophia Castellano had appeared in intelligence briefings during his military service. Though always in the margins, never as a primary subject, she moved through the shadows of international society, a woman whose beauty and sophistication opened doors that remained closed to more obvious operators. If she was involved with Ashworth, it meant the conspiracy had international dimensions that made Crawford's investigation infinitely more dangerous. Dr. Margaret Reeves arrived at police headquarters shortly after noon, her medical examiner's report tucked beneath her arm like a death sentence. Her silver hair caught the pale winter sunlight streaming through Crawford's office windows as she delivered findings that complicated an already labyrinthine case. "Vincent Ashworth was poisoned," she announced without preamble, her clinical precision cutting through the morning's speculative atmosphere. Strangulation was secondary, probably to ensure death after the poison took effect. The substance was chloroform, synthetic, sophisticated, the kind of thing that requires laboratory production and professional knowledge to administer effectively. Crawford felt the pieces of the puzzle shifting into new configurations. How long would it take to work? 15 to 20 minutes for complete paralysis, 30 to 40 minutes for death. But here's the truly disturbing part. He would have been conscious the entire time, aware of what was happening but unable to move, unable to cry out. Whoever did this wanted him to suffer, to know he was dying, and to have time to think about why. The psychological profile of their killer came into sharper focus. This wasn't a crime of passion or a simple assassination. It was an execution designed to send a message, carried out by someone with access to military-grade chemicals and the emotional coldness to watch a man die slowly while maintaining the facade of intimate conversation. Henley's investigation into hotel security had yielded equally troubling results. The master key used to access the 23rd floor at 9:45 p.m. belonged to assistant manager Diana Walsh. She reported, consulting her notes with professional detachment. Problem is, Walsh was conducting a staff meeting in the basement from 9:30 to 10:15 p.m. 12 witnesses, airtight alibi. Someone copied her key, but the hotel security measures make that supposedly impossible. Crawford's phone rang with the harsh insistence of bad news. The voice on the other end belonged to Captain Murphy, whose Irish accent had grown even thicker since the previous evening. "Bill, we've got complications. Federal agents are downstairs asking questions about the Ashworth case. They're not FBI, something more specialized. They want to see you immediately." The arrival of federal agents confirmed Crawford's worst suspicions. These weren't ordinary government investigators, but representatives of agencies whose very existence was classified. Men whose business cards bore no agency names, and whose authority derived from statutes the general public never saw. Their leader, a tall man with prematurely gray hair and eyes like winter ice, introduced himself simply as Agent Miller. "Detective Crawford, we appreciate your thoroughness in investigating Mr. Ashworth's death," Miller said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that brooked no argument. However, this case now falls under federal jurisdiction. We'll be taking over all evidence, all witness statements, and all ongoing investigations. Crawford's military training had taught him to recognize power when he encountered it, but his detective's instincts rebelled against surrendering a case that had consumed his thoughts and invaded his dreams. On whose authority? He asked, though he suspected the answer would satisfy no one but the bureaucrats who issued such orders. Miller's smile contained no warmth. The kind of authority that doesn't require explanation. Detective. Mr. Ashworth's business dealings touched matters of national security. His death could compromise ongoing operations that affect American interests around the world. I'm sure you understand the need for discretion. But Crawford had spent too many years investigating crimes to accept easy answers, and his discovery of the intelligence pin had convinced him that Ashworth's murder was about more than national security. It was about secrets that powerful people would kill to protect, about corruption that reached into the highest levels of government, and about a conspiracy that made his small role in seeking justice seem both crucial and impossibly dangerous. After Miller and his team departed with boxes of evidence, Crawford sat alone in his office, officially relieved of the case, but psychologically unable to let it go. The photograph of Sophia Castellano remained on his desk, a reminder that some questions couldn't be answered through official channels, and some truths could only be discovered by those willing to risk everything. That evening, Crawford made a decision that would define the rest of his career, and possibly determine whether he lived to see another Christmas. He drove through the rain-slicked streets of Manhattan to the Eleganté Hotel, not as an investigating detective, but as a private citizen seeking answers that official channels would never provide. The hotel's lobby maintained its atmosphere of sophisticated elegance, but Crawford now saw it through different eyes. Every guest could be a foreign agent, every staff member a potential conspirator, every shadow a hiding place for secrets that killed. He approached the concierge, an elderly man named Frederick, whose white mustache and formal bearing suggested decades of discretionary service to the wealthy and powerful. "I'm looking for information about Sophia Castellano," Crawford said, keeping his voice low and his demeanor casual. "I understand she was a regular guest." Frederick's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes, recognition perhaps, or fear. "I'm sorry, sir, but hotel policy prevents us from discussing our guests. Perhaps if you spoke with the manager." Crawford slipped a $20 bill across the marble counter, a gesture that in other circumstances might have been crude, but in the Eleganté's refined atmosphere seemed almost natural. "I'm not looking for official information. Just impressions, the kind of observations a professional might make about someone who spent considerable time in your establishment." Money had a way of loosening tongues even in the most exclusive establishments. Frederick pocketed the bill with practiced discretion, before speaking in barely audible tones. Miss Castellano was particular about her privacy. She never used the elevators during busy periods, always requested tables in restaurant corners where she could observe other guests, and had an unusual habit of speaking multiple languages during phone conversations. Italian, French, what sounded like Russian. Most guests who speak multiple languages stick to English in public settings. The revelation that Sophia Castellano spoke Russian added another layer to an already complex international conspiracy. During Crawford's military service, Russian-speaking assets were either Soviet operatives or American intelligence officers trained for deep cover operations. Either possibility made her involvement with Ashworth exponentially more dangerous. Crawford's investigation led him next to the hotel's service areas, where he hoped to find Tommy Santos, the room service waiter who had delivered dinner to Ashworth's room on the night of the murder. He found the young man in the hotel's massive kitchen, preparing silver service for the evening's distinguished guests. Santos, barely 21 with nervous eyes and hands that shook slightly when he wasn't working, confirmed the timeline that had emerged from other witnesses. "Mr. Ashworth was alone when I delivered dinner at 8:45, he said, glancing around nervously as if afraid of being overheard. "But he ordered dinner for two, and he seemed excited, you know. like he was expecting someone special. Did he say anything about his guest? Santos hesitated, clearly weighing the risks of speaking against his need to unburden himself of disturbing memories. He made a joke, kind of. Said his guest was dangerous but irresistible, like he was talking about a woman who might break his heart. But the way he said it, it sounded like he meant a different kind of danger. The pieces of Vincent Ashworth's final evening continued to assemble into a picture of a man who knew he was walking into danger, but couldn't resist the temptation. Whether that temptation was romantic, financial, or something altogether more complex, remained to be determined. Crawford's next stop was the hotel's telephone switchboard, where operators connected calls and monitored communications with the discretionary blindness that luxury establishments required. The head operator, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Catherine Boyle, had worked at the Eleganté since before the war, and possessed the kind of institutional memory that made her invaluable to Crawford's unofficial investigation. Room 338 received 3 calls on the evening in question. She reported after Crawford explained his interest in general terms that avoided mentioning murder or federal agents. One at 7:30 p.m. from a local number, one at 8:15 p.m. from an international exchange sounded like overseas, but the connection was too poor to determine the country, and one at 9:20 p.m. from a payphone somewhere in the city. The timing of the final call, just 10 minutes before the argument that witnesses had heard from Ashworth's room, suggested last-minute coordination between the victim and his killer. Someone had used a payphone to avoid leaving traceable records, a level of operational security that spoke to professional training and careful planning. As Crawford left the Eleganté Hotel for the second time in 2 days, he felt the weight of conspiracy pressing down on him like a physical force. Vincent Ashworth had been murdered not by a jealous lover or a business rival, but by professionals carrying out an operation that touched the highest levels of international intelligence. Sophia Castellano wasn't just a beautiful woman with dangerous secrets. She was an operative whose very presence in Ashworth's life had marked him for death. The rain continued to fall on Manhattan's neon-lit streets as Crawford walked through the November darkness, his mind racing through possibilities that grew more terrifying with each passing hour. Somewhere in the city, federal agents were suppressing evidence and controlling the narrative. Somewhere else, Sophia Castellano was either planning her next operation or lying dead in a location where she would never be found. And somewhere in the shadowy world where patriotism and profit merged into something unrecognizable, the people who had ordered Ashworth's death were covering their tracks and eliminating loose ends with the methodical precision that made Crawford realize his own life might now be in danger. The intelligence pin felt heavier in his pocket as he walked through the rain-soaked streets, a reminder that some secrets were too dangerous to know, and some conspiracies too powerful to challenge. But Detective Bill Crawford had spent his career fighting for justice in a world that often made justice seem impossible, and Vincent Ashworth's murder had become more than just a case. It had become a crusade that would either expose the truth or destroy the man seeking it. As he reached his apartment building, Crawford noticed a black sedan parked across the street, its windows too dark to see inside, but its presence too convenient to be coincidental. The watchers had found him, which meant his unofficial investigation had touched nerves that stretched from Manhattan hotel rooms to Washington backrooms where American foreign policy was written in invisible ink. The game had changed, the stakes had escalated, and Detective Bill Crawford was about to discover that seeking justice for Vincent Ashworth might cost him everything he had ever believed about law, order, and the country he had once served in uniform. Detective Bill Crawford didn't sleep that night. He sat in his apartment's darkened living room, watching the black sedan through rain-streaked windows, while nursing bourbon that tasted like liquid regret. The watchers maintained their vigil with professional patience, occasionally lighting cigarettes that glowed like fireflies in the November darkness. Crawford understood their message. He was no longer investigating a murder. He was living on borrowed time. By dawn, the sedan had disappeared, but Crawford knew better than to interpret its absence as safety. He had spent enough years in military intelligence to recognize the rhythm of surveillance operations. The watchers had withdrawn to give him the illusion of freedom while they prepared for more decisive action. Vincent Ashworth's murder was becoming Crawford's death sentence, 1 hour at a time. Patricia Henley arrived at his apartment at 7:30 a.m., her face pale with exhaustion and fear. She carried a leather satchel containing documents that officially didn't exist, material she had copied before the federal agents seized the case files. Her hands trembled slightly as she spread photographs and witness statements across Crawford's kitchen table like tarot cards predicting disaster. "They came to the station at midnight," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not just Agent Miller, a whole team. They confiscated everything, Bill. Every photograph, every statement, every piece of evidence." Captain Murphy tried to resist, but they had papers signed by people whose names I've only seen in newspaper headlines. Crawford studied the contraband documents, his detective's mind cataloging details that painted an increasingly terrifying picture. Sophia Castellano wasn't just an art dealer with international connections. She was a ghost, a woman whose existence could be erased from official records with the stroke of a classified pen. Bank records showed payments from accounts connected to weapons dealers, revolutionary movements and intelligence agencies that operated in the shadow spaces between legal and necessary. "There's more," Henley continued, pulling a manila envelope from her satchel with hands that shook like autumn leaves. "I found this hidden in Ashworth's hotel room safe yesterday, before the federal agents arrived. The hotel manager gave me access, thinking I was still officially on the case." The envelope contained documents that made Crawford's blood turn to ice water. Letters written in Ashworth's handwriting detailed arms sales to revolutionary groups in Guatemala, technology transfers to fascist organizations in Argentina, and weapons shipments to both sides of emerging conflicts in Southeast Asia. But these weren't just business records. They were confessions, insurance policies written by a man who knew his activities had made him expendable. The final document in the envelope was a letter addressed simply to Bill Crawford, NYPD. Ashworth had known he would be murdered, had anticipated that Crawford would investigate, and had left behind a message that read like a voice from beyond the grave. "Detective Crawford, if you are reading this, then my past has finally caught up with me. Sophia Castellano is not who she claims to be. Her real name is Katerina Volkov, former Soviet intelligence, now freelance. She was sent to eliminate me, not for money, but for information. I have been selling American military secrets to foreign governments for 7 years. The intelligence pin you found belongs to Colonel James Morrison, my handler in the Pentagon. He is the architect of a conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of American government. The evidence is hidden in Safety Deposit Box 348 at Manhattan Trust. The key is taped beneath my hotel room's writing desk. Trust no one in your department. They have been watching you since the night you discovered my body." Crawford felt the world shift around him like a building collapsing in slow motion. Vincent Ashworth hadn't been a victim of international espionage. He had been a traitor whose death was both justice and cover-up. Colonel Morrison, a man Crawford remembered from his military days as a patriot and hero, was orchestrating treason on a scale that defied comprehension. The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside Crawford's apartment sent both detectives diving for their service weapons, but instead of federal agents or assassins, they heard the familiar voice of Mrs. Kowalski, the elderly widow who lived next door and collected cats like other people collected regrets. Crawford's paranoia was consuming his judgment, turning every sound into a threat and every shadow into an enemy. But paranoia, Crawford realized, might be the only thing keeping him alive. The trip to Manhattan Trust required elaborate precautions that would have seemed absurd a week earlier, but now felt like minimal survival protocols. Crawford and Henley took separate routes through the city, using taxis, subway trains, and foot travel to ensure they weren't followed. The November morning had dawned clear and cold, Manhattan's skyline sharp against a blue sky that seemed to mock the darkness of their investigation. Safety Deposit Box 348 contained documents that confirmed Crawford's worst fears and exceeded his most paranoid suspicions. Colonel Morrison hadn't just been selling American secrets. He had been orchestrating a systematic betrayal of American interests that stretched back to the end of World War II. Arms deals, technology transfers, intelligence operations, all designed to destabilize American allies, while enriching a network of military officials, defense contractors, and politicians whose loyalty belonged to the highest bidder. Sophia Castellano, Katerina Volkov had been sent to eliminate Ashworth, not by Soviet intelligence, but by Morrison himself. Ashworth had become unreliable, demanding larger payments and threatening to expose the conspiracy unless his conditions were met. His murder had been contracted through intermediaries that gave Morrison plausible deniability while removing a threat to operations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The most damning document in the safety deposit box was a letter signed by Morrison and addressed to a Swiss banking institution, authorizing the transfer of $25 million to accounts controlled by known Soviet agents. The date on the letter was 3 days after Ashworth's murder, suggesting that the weapons contractor's death had cleared the way for the largest treasonous transaction in American history. Crawford photographed every document with a camera borrowed from the police department's evidence room, understanding that these images represented both salvation and damnation. With this evidence, he could expose a conspiracy that reached into the Pentagon and potentially prevent the transfer of American military secrets to hostile foreign powers. Without it, he would remain a detective chasing shadows while traitors sold his country to the highest bidder. But as Crawford and Henley left Manhattan Trust, they discovered that their elaborate precautions had been inadequate. Agent Miller waited beside a black Cadillac across from the bank, his winter-gray eyes fixed on them with the patient malevolence of a predator who had cornered his prey. 2 other men flanked him, their bulging coats suggesting weapons and their expressions promising violence. "Detective Crawford," Miller called across the busy street, his voice carrying over the noise of traffic and pedestrians. "I believe you have something that belongs to the United States government." Crawford's hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon, but Henley's restraining touch reminded him that they were surrounded by innocent civilians who would become casualties in any gunfight. Miller's positioning wasn't accidental. He had chosen a location where Crawford's options were limited, and the consequences of resistance would be measured in civilian blood. "I'm a police detective investigating a murder," Crawford called back, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "The last time I checked, that was still legal in America." Miller's smile contained no warmth. "Detective, you're investigating matters that fall under the Espionage Act of 1917. That makes you either a patriot working within proper channels or a traitor interfering with national security operations. Which would you prefer to be remembered as?" The threat was clear, but Crawford had spent too many years fighting for justice to surrender now. Vincent Ashworth might have been a traitor, but his murder had exposed a conspiracy that made his individual crimes seem insignificant. Colonel Morrison and his network were selling American security to foreign powers, and stopping them was worth any personal risk. Crawford made a decision that would define the rest of his life, however long that might be. Instead of crossing the street toward Miller and his associates, he grabbed Henley's arm and plunged into the crowd of pedestrians moving through Manhattan's financial district. Their only chance lay in reaching sympathetic ears before Miller's people could silence them permanently. The chase through Manhattan streets felt like a nightmare filmed in broad daylight. Crawford and Henley weaved through crowds of businessmen and shoppers, using the city's natural chaos to mask their movements, while Miller's team pursued them with professional persistence. Every alley could be a trap, every building could hide more federal agents, every moment could be their last. They reached the offices of the New York Herald-Tribune 20 minutes ahead of their pursuers, though Crawford suspected the delay was intentional. Miller wanted them to believe they had reached safety before springing whatever trap he had prepared. The newspaper's city editor, a hard-bitten journalist named Frank Morrison, no relation to the colonel, listened to their story with the skeptical attention that separated real reporters from publicity seekers. "You're telling me that a Pentagon colonel has been selling American military secrets to the Soviets?" Morrison said, his cigarette-stained fingers drumming against his desk while he studied the photographs Crawford had taken. "And that federal agents murdered a defense contractor to cover it up. And you want me to publish this story based on evidence you obtained through unauthorized access to a safety deposit box?" Crawford felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on him. Publishing the story would expose Morrison's conspiracy but might also compromise ongoing legitimate intelligence operations. Remaining silent would allow traitors to continue selling American secrets, but would protect innocent people from the consequences of premature revelation. The decision was taken away from him by the sound of federal agents entering the newspaper's lobby. Miller's voice echoed through the building as he demanded access to the newsroom, his authority backed by warrants that brooked no legal resistance. Crawford realized that his evidence would never reach the public through official channels. Too many powerful people had too much to lose. But Detective Bill Crawford had learned during his military service that sometimes the right choice wasn't the legal choice, and sometimes justice required sacrificing everything for principles that couldn't be measured in career advancement or personal safety. He made a final desperate gamble, using the newspaper's phone system to call every major news outlet in the city simultaneously. For 30 minutes, Crawford dictated the essential facts of Morrison's conspiracy to reporters at 12 different newspapers and radio stations. He provided enough detail to ensure the story would survive even if he didn't, creating a distributed record that no single authority could suppress. By the time Miller's agents reached the newsroom, Crawford's evidence had spread through Manhattan's media network like spilled ink through paper. The confrontation in the Herald Tribune newsroom played out with the inevitability of Greek tragedy. Miller and his agents surrounded Crawford and Henley while newspaper staff looked on with the fascinated horror of people witnessing history being written in real time. The federal agents' weapons remained holstered, but their presence spoke of violence barely contained by the civilized veneer of legal authority. "Detective Crawford," Miller said, his voice carrying resignation rather than anger, "you have just compromised ongoing intelligence operations that have taken years to develop. You may have cost American lives and certainly have damaged American interests around the world." Crawford met Miller's gaze with steady defiance. "Colonel Morrison has been selling American secrets to foreign powers for 7 years. If that doesn't damage American interests, then nothing does." Miller's expression shifted, revealing something that might have been admiration or regret. "Colonel Morrison has been selling carefully selected disinformation to foreign powers under the direction of the Central Intelligence Agency. Every document, every weapons shipment, every technology transfer has been designed to mislead Soviet intelligence about American capabilities and intentions. Vincent Ashworth's murder compromised the most successful counterintelligence operation in American history. The revelation hit Crawford like a physical blow. Ashworth hadn't been murdered by government conspirators. He had been eliminated by Soviet agents who discovered his role in an American disinformation campaign. Sophia Castellano, Katerina Volkov, had been a real Soviet operative carrying out a real assassination to protect Soviet interests from American deception. Miller continued with the patient thoroughness of a professor explaining complex mathematics to struggling students. Ashworth threatened to expose the operation unless he received additional compensation. "We were negotiating with him when Volkov struck. She used his greed against him, convincing him to meet with her by promising information about Soviet intelligence that he could sell. Instead, she poisoned him and searched his room for evidence of the disinformation campaign." Crawford felt the foundations of his investigation crumbling beneath him. The intelligence pin belonged to Colonel Morrison, yes, but not as evidence of treason, as evidence of the most successful counterintelligence operation since World War II. Morrison has been feeding false information to Soviet contacts while documenting their intelligence networks. Ashworth's murder set back American intelligence efforts by decades. The truth was more complex and more devastating than any conspiracy Crawford had imagined. He had been chasing shadows while real traitors operated in plain sight, pursuing justice while undermining legitimate intelligence operations, fighting for American interests while inadvertently serving Soviet ones. But even as Miller's explanation recontextualized everything Crawford thought he understood, one question remained unanswered. Where is Sophia Castellano now? Miller's expression darkened. Katerina Volkov disappeared after murdering Ashworth. Our best intelligence suggests she has returned to Moscow with information about Morrison's operation. The damage she has done to American intelligence capabilities will take years to repair. The confrontation in the Herald Tribune newsroom ended not with arrests or violence, but with the quiet resignation of people who understood that some battles couldn't be won through traditional means. Crawford had exposed what he believed was a conspiracy, only to discover that he had been manipulated by a larger conspiracy that made his original suspicions seem naive. Miller and his agents departed as quietly as they had arrived, leaving Crawford and Henley to face the consequences of their investigation. The newspaper editors, initially excited by the prospect of exposing government corruption, found themselves holding evidence of legitimate intelligence operations that couldn't be published without compromising national security. In the end, Vincent Ashworth's murder remained officially unsolved. His killer disappeared into the vast anonymity of the Cold War's shadow operations, and the conspiracy Crawford had fought to expose dissolved into the gray areas where patriotism and betrayal merged into something unrecognizable. Detective Bill Crawford returned to his regular duties with the knowledge that justice wasn't always achievable and truth wasn't always beneficial. The intelligence pin disappeared into evidence lockers that would never be opened. The photographs of Morrison's documents were classified beyond any security clearance Crawford would ever possess, and the Eleganté Hotel resumed its elegant operations as if Vincent Ashworth had never existed. But on November nights when rain fell on Manhattan's neon-lit streets, Crawford sometimes stood at his apartment window and wondered about the larger games being played in rooms he would never enter, by people whose loyalties served interests he would never fully understand. The corpse in room 300 had taught him that some mysteries were designed to remain unsolved, some secrets were too dangerous to expose, and some forms of justice could only be achieved by accepting that justice wasn't always possible. Sophia Castellano, Katerina Volkov, had committed the perfect crime, not because she was clever enough to avoid detection, but because she was operating within a system where murder was just another tool of statecraft, and detection would serve her enemies' interests more than her own. In the shadow world of international intelligence, Vincent Ashworth's death was neither crime nor justice. It was simply business conducted with more permanent solutions. The Eleganté Hotel kept its secrets, Manhattan kept its mysteries, and Detective Bill Crawford kept his knowledge of truths that were too complex for courtrooms and too dangerous for newspapers. In the end, the only justice Vincent Ashworth would receive was the knowledge that his murder had revealed the price of playing games where the stakes were measured in national security and the players were willing to kill to protect secrets that might not even be true. The rain continued to fall on the city's glittering streets, washing away evidence and memory alike, while somewhere in Moscow, a beautiful woman with deadly secrets prepared for her next assignment in the endless war between truth and deception that defined the modern world.